Taiwan's power grid runs on a countdown clock. Not a metaphor, a literal countdown. Right now, at this moment, Taiwan holds approximately 10 to 12 days of liquefied natural gas reserves. That is the number, 10 to 12 days, and roughly half of Taiwan's entire electricity supply runs on that gas. So when the Center for Strategic and International Studies released the results of 26 wargame iterations in July 2025, the headline wasn't about missiles or aircraft carriers or amphibious landing craft. The headline was this: China doesn't need to invade Taiwan to win. It just needs to stop one ship per day from docking. That is what we are unpacking today. The fatal flaw that China has already identified, already wargamed, and already rehearsed, while Washington has spent the better part of a decade focused on the wrong threat entirely. Let's get into it. Taiwan imports approximately 97% of its energy. Every barrel of oil, every ton of coal, every cubic meter of liquefied natural gas arrives by sea. There is no pipeline to Japan. There is no land bridge to a friendly neighbor. The island sits in the middle of contested water, and the arteries that keep its economy alive are fully exposed. This is not a secret. Taiwan's own Minister of National Defense, Wellington Koo, stood up in October 2024, just days after China's latest military exercise wrapped up around the island, and said it plainly. Quote, "It's undeniable that the imports of LNG are our weakest link." He then asked rhetorically whether Taiwan could continue industrial production during a real blockade. He left the question hanging, because the answer is uncomfortable. Taiwan's two main LNG receiving terminals, Yungan and Kaohsiung and Taichung, are operated by the state-owned CPC Corporation. Together they handle roughly 18.5 million metric tons of LNG per year. They sit on Taiwan's west coast, facing mainland China, within range of Chinese missiles, accessible only through waters that the PLA Eastern Theater Command has now rehearsed controlling repeatedly and with increasing precision. Taiwan receives approximately one LNG tanker per day. One. You interdict that one ship, and the countdown begins. Now here is where the story gets more complicated and more dangerous than most analysts are willing to say out loud. For years, Washington built its Taiwan defense architecture around a specific threat model, a Chinese amphibious invasion. Carrier strike groups, Marine Expeditionary Forces, the 7th Fleet as the tripwire. The logic was that if China tried to storm the beaches of Taiwan, the United States would have a clear casus belli, a clear military response, and a clear moment of confrontation. The entire deterrence framework was calibrated for that scenario. But Mark Kansian, a senior advisor at CSIS and a retired Marine colonel who led the 26 wargame blockade study alongside his co-authors Matthew Kansian and MIT's Eric Hegenbotham, presented findings on July 31st, 2025 that reframed the entire problem. The study, funded by the Smith-Richardson Foundation and the Diane Davis Spencer Foundation, didn't ask whether America could defeat a Chinese invasion. It asked something harder. What happens when China doesn't invade? What happens when Beijing simply draws a cordon around the island and waits? Because here is what Chinese military doctrine actually says. The People's Liberation Army formally recognizes what it calls the Joint Blockade Campaign, Nanhefengsuodanyi, as one of its 5 core joint campaign types. This isn't speculation, it is written doctrine. And since August of 2022, the PLA has conducted at least 8 major exercises around Taiwan, each one iterating on blockade mechanics with greater specificity. Joint Sword 2023, Joint Sword 2024A in May, Joint Sword 2024B in October, Justice Mission 2025 in December, Straight Thunder 2025A in April, each exercise more refined than the last, each one targeting, among other things, LNG terminals. When PLA Eastern Theater Command spokesman Li Shi announced Joint Sword 2024B on October 14, 2024, he was explicit. The exercise focused on, quote, blockades on key ports and areas, assaults on maritime and ground targets, and joint seizure of comprehensive superiority. 6 months later, when Senior Colonel Shi Yi announced Straight Thunder 2025A, he described it as testing regional control, joint blockade, and precision strike capabilities. These are not vague statements. These are operational declarations. But if you thought the exercise cadence was the most alarming part, Wait until you see what Washington's own intelligence community concluded. The 2026 DNI Annual Threat Assessment, the official, published judgment of the United States intelligence community, stated that China does not currently plan to execute an invasion of Taiwan and does not have a fixed timeline for achieving unification. Bonnie Glaser at the German Marshall Fund agreed. Xi Jinping, she said, prefers to achieve that goal without using force. The PLA purge of roughly 100 senior officers since 2022 makes near-term military action even less likely. Read that twice. Washington's deterrence framework is optimized for an invasion that the intelligence community now says China isn't planning. Meanwhile, China has spent 3 years rehearsing the blockade that the framework was never designed to stop. That is the gap. That is the flaw. And now let's trace exactly how it plays out. Zhongshun Chen, an associate researcher at the Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research, broke down the arithmetic with precision. Taiwan's LNG reserves sustain approximately 11 days of normal winter consumption. In summer, when industrial demand shifts, that number drops to 7 days. The government mandates an 11-day minimum security stock, a floor that is, in practice, the ceiling. CPC Corporation operates an underground gas storage facility with roughly 26 days of capacity, but that figure assumes optimal operating conditions, full drawdown, and no simultaneous disruption to the distribution network. Coal reserves run longer, approximately 42 days. But coal cannot simply substitute for gas in Taiwan's power mix. The grid has been deliberately restructured. LNG-fired generation now accounts for 42 to 50% of Taiwan's electricity in 2024 and 2025. The infrastructure is not interchangeable. You cannot flip a switch and run a gas turbine on coal. Oil reserves are more substantial, around 146 days. But Taiwan's economy doesn't run on oil. Its fabs run on electricity, and its electricity runs on gas. Timothy Heath at the Rand Corporation put the vulnerability in bluntest terms when he described LNG carriers to Asia Sentinel. Not only defenseless, but they are highly combustible targets. In war, they would be extremely vulnerable. An LNG tanker carrying roughly 75,000 cubic meters of liquefied natural gas is not a warship. It does not evade. It does not defend itself. And in contested waters, it does not need to be sunk to be stopped. It only needs to be threatened. When crews and insurers and shipping companies calculate that transiting toward a blockade zone means a potential catastrophe, the ships simply stop coming. Now bring TSMC into this picture, and the stakes become global. TSMC produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. It holds somewhere between 53 and 64% of the global foundry market, depending on the metric you use. And TSMC alone consumes roughly 8% of Taiwan's total electricity, a figure that could rise to as much as 24% by 2030 as the world's demand for advanced chips accelerates. Chip fabrication requires uninterrupted power. Not mostly uninterrupted, not 99% reliable, uninterrupted. A voltage fluctuation of the wrong magnitude can destroy an entire batch of wafers mid-process. A grid failure doesn't just pause production. It destroys work in progress, damages sensitive equipment, and requires days of controlled restart procedures. Taiwan's semiconductor industry represents approximately 25% of the island's GDP. A blockade-induced grid failure doesn't just hurt Taiwan. It begins shuttering the fabs that produce the chips inside every advanced weapon system, every data center, every AI accelerator, and every consumer device on the planet. The economic shockwave would be immediate and global. And that is precisely what makes the blockade scenario so strategically elegant from Beijing's perspective. The cost falls not just on Taiwan, but on every nation that depends on the supply chain running through it. But here's where the strategy cuts even deeper, because the blockade creates a decision problem for Washington that an invasion does not. An amphibious assault is unambiguous. Chinese troops landing on Taiwanese beaches is a clear act of war. The decision calculus, while still difficult, has a defined trigger. A blockade is different. A blockade is a gray zone operation. China can call it a quarantine. It can call it maritime security exercises. It can announce temporary safety exclusion zones, the same language it used during Joint Sword 2024B. The act itself is coercive, but it is not, in strict legal terms, an act of war against the United States. American ships that attempt to break a blockade become the aggressor in Beijing's framing. And every day that Washington deliberates, Taiwan's LNG reserves tick down. Su Tzu-yun, the director of defense strategy at Taiwan's Institute for National Defense and Security Research, analyzed Joint Sword 2024B and noted specifically that there was a rather special component, the so-called quarantine or blockade, during which they practiced their blockading abilities. He was describing an exercise, but the capability being rehearsed is real, and the decision timeline it imposes on Washington, measured in days, not weeks, is the point. Ryan Hass at the Brookings Institution was direct. One of Taiwan's greatest strategic vulnerabilities is its reliance on energy imports. His recommendation was the obvious one: expand stockpiles as a short-term priority. But stockpiling LNG at scale is not a simple logistics problem. LNG requires cryogenic storage at -162 degrees Celsius. You cannot warehouse it the way you warehouse grain or ammunition. Taiwan would need to build new regasification infrastructure, new storage terminals, and do so on a compressed timeline in a constrained space with a state utility, Taipower, that had already accumulated losses exceeding 420 billion new Taiwan dollars, roughly 14 billion US dollars, by the end of 2024, partly from absorbing high LNG cost increases. The fiscal hole and the strategic hole are the same hole. Kovin Tingchen Sun, a senior policy advisor in Taiwan's legislative ecosystem, said it without diplomatic cushioning: "There's no way Taiwan's going to survive a month under a full maritime cutoff." That statement lands differently when you understand the arithmetic behind it. So what are the options? The CSIS wargames surface several. Taiwan could attempt to diversify its energy mix and reduce LNG dependence. President Lai Ching-te, after a referendum in August 2025, acknowledged society's expectations for diverse energy options and left the door open to a reversal on nuclear power, a significant shift for a DPP government formerly pledged to a nuclear-free homeland. Nuclear baseload generation doesn't arrive by tanker. It doesn't have a 10-day reserve problem. But building nuclear capacity takes a decade, not a year, and the political pathway is still contested. Alternatively, the United States and its allies could attempt to escort LNG tankers through contested waters, but that requires pre-positioning naval assets specifically for that mission, rules of engagement that accept the possibility of a direct military clash with PLA Navy and Coast Guard vessels, and an allied coalition willing to hold that line for weeks or months while diplomatic resolution is attempted. Joseph Webster at the Atlantic Council noted that Taiwan and wealthy democracies would likely outbid other importers in a supply crunch, making any shortage more financial than physical in the short term. But that assessment assumes the tankers can physically reach the terminals, which is precisely what the maritime cutoff is designed to prevent. And then there is the broader strategic context that makes all of this more urgent. Webster warned in March 2026 that if the Strait of Hormuz were blocked by naval obstacles, reopening it could take weeks or even months. A simultaneous Taiwan maritime cutoff and Hormuz closure would stress LNG markets globally in ways that emergency financial responses cannot fully absorb. China does not need to coordinate with Iran for that scenario to unfold. It only needs to pick its moment carefully. Admiral Philip Davidson's 2021 warning about a 2027 window has been largely reassessed following the 2026 intelligence community assessment. But reassessing the invasion timeline should not, and this is the critical point, reassess the maritime cutoff timeline. The maritime cutoff is not a fallback option for when an invasion becomes feasible. It is an independent, standalone coercive instrument that China has been refining for 3 years. The Davidson window may have shifted. The maritime cutoff window has not closed. It has widened. The 26 wargames run by Kantian, and Higginbotham converged on a finding that should be sitting at the center of every serious Taiwan policy discussion happening right now. The strategic center of gravity in a Taiwan crisis is not the beach. It is the grid. It is the gas terminal on the west coast that faces mainland China. It is the one tanker per day that Taiwan cannot afford to miss. The fatal flaw that the CSIS study exposed is not a new vulnerability that China created. It is a pre-existing condition that China has studied, mapped, rehearsed, and is now prepared to exploit at the moment of its choosing. Washington spent years building a deterrence architecture for an invasion scenario. China responded by developing a coercion instrument that sidesteps that architecture entirely, one that imposes a 10-day countdown before the policy apparatus in Washington has even agreed on what to call it, 10 to 12 days. That is what stands between Taiwan's grid and darkness. Not missiles, not landing craft, not the Seventh Fleet, one tanker, one terminal, one countdown. The question that the CSIS study leaves open, and that no one in Washington has answered cleanly, is whether America's security commitment to Taiwan was ever designed to stop a clock.